The evening of July 17, 1891, was warm and ordinary. 4 women were walking home along Lime Road outside Hanover, New Hampshire, after a meeting of the local Grange. Christy Warden walked with her sister Fanny, her mother Louisa, and their friend Louisa Goodell. The road was familiar. The distance was short. There was no reason to hurry. A man stepped out of the shadows onto the road. He was bearded, and in the dim light, the women did not recognize him immediately. He was carrying a revolver. He spoke first to the mother. "You know me, Mrs. Warden. I am Frank Almy. I only want to talk to Christy. The rest of you run along. You go and I won't hurt you. If you interfere with me, I will shoot you like dogs." Then he grabbed Christy by the arm. "Christy, I have come 1,000 miles to see you." Fanny seized her sister's other arm and pulled back. Almy dragged both of them toward the fence at the side of the road. Fanny stumbled and lost her grip. He pulled Christy through the fence into the meadow beyond, toward a brook, into the darkness. Fanny got to her feet and followed. She heard her sister's voice from somewhere ahead. "Oh, Fanny, come and help me. He is tearing my clothes all off." Almy fired 3 times in Fanny's direction. All 3 shots missed. She ran back toward the road to find help. She returned minutes later with a neighbor named Emmett Marshall. They heard 2 more gunshots. Then they saw a figure disappear into the brush. Christy Warden was lying in the meadow. She had been shot point blank in the head. She was 28 years old. The man who killed her had been living in her family's barn for more than a month. The Abbott family had deep roots in the Connecticut River Valley. Eliphalet Abbott owned the mills that gave North Thetford, Vermont, its economic foundation. His grandson George was born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1857. His mother died 3 days after giving birth. George was raised by his uncle and aunt, and was, by all accounts, handsome, intelligent, and a capable student. He was also stealing from his neighbors by the time he was old enough to be trusted alone outside. At 14, he took a stove from a neighbor named Daniel Prescott. The Abbott family's influence kept it out of court. Sometime later, George encountered Prescott walking his dog on a public road and, without a word, drew a revolver and shot the animal. Then he pointed the gun at Prescott and told him to stop where he was, or he would receive the same treatment. Prescott did not report the incident. He had apparently absorbed the lesson. In the early 1870s, Abbott partnered with one of his uncle's employees and ran a series of house burglaries across the river valley. When he was finally arrested, the inventory of what he was carrying was specific: stolen watches, 2 revolvers, a dirk, a bottle of chloroform, a bottle of strychnine, a bottle of arsenic. Another revolver and another dirk on his person, separately. This was not a young man improvising. He was sentenced to 4 years in the New Hampshire State Prison. His father, upon learning of the conviction, went to his barn and hanged himself. Abbott was released, expressed the intention to go straight, and did not. A second gang, the same territory, the same work. When law enforcement caught up with him this time, there was a gunfight, and Abbott reportedly sustained somewhere in the vicinity of 20 gunshot wounds before he was taken. He survived. He was sentenced to 15 years in Windsor Prison. He would serve 7 of them. Windsor Prison sits on a hill above the Connecticut River in Vermont, a stone building that had housed the state's most serious offenders since before the Civil War. George Abbott arrived there in the late 1870s as a convicted burglar with a history of violence and a body still healing from multiple gunshot wounds. He was, by all accounts, a model prisoner. He was also, from the first days of his sentence, planning his escape. Over the course of 7 years, he accumulated material. scraps of string, lengths of cord, sections of iron pipe. Each piece obtained quietly, stored carefully, each one unremarkable on its own. In aggregate, they became something. A rope ladder, crude but functional, capable of carrying a man's weight over a prison wall. On September 30th, 1887, George Abbott used the ladder and walked away from Windsor Prison. He left behind a 15-year sentence, with 8 years still remaining, and a name that had appeared in court records, prison ledgers, and newspaper accounts across 2 states. He needed a new one. He drifted south, working his way through jobs that required physical labor and asked few questions. Ranch work in Texas, oystering in Baltimore, engineering in Savannah, riveting in Edgemoor, Delaware. Each place temporary, each job honest by all available evidence. He was trying something he had never seriously attempted before. The name he chose was Frank Almy. In July of 1890, Frank Almy boarded a train north and returned to New England. 33 years old, approximately 10 of them spent in prison. A new name, a history he had not yet told anyone, and no particular plan beyond finding work. He found it at a farm outside Hanover, New Hampshire, belonging to a man named Andrew Warden. Andrew and Louisa Warden had raised 7 children on their farm in Hanover. The 2 eldest daughters had already left home. That left 5 still in the house, including 15-year-old Fanny, who took an immediate and unambiguous dislike to the new hired hand, and 28-year-old Christy, who did not. Almy was given a trial week. Andrew Warden was satisfied and hired him through the following March. The work was ordinary farm labor, and Almy performed it without incident. What was less ordinary was what developed between him and Christy Warden over the months that followed. It was not, by the standards of the time, a courtship exactly. There was no formal understanding, no acknowledged engagement, but it had the shape of one. They went on sleigh rides. They attended church together. They exchanged Christmas presents. On winter evenings, they read aloud to each other from Edward Bulwer Lytton's The Last Days of Pompeii, taking turns with the pages. Christy Warden was not naive, and she was not passive. She worked part-time as a secretary for Professor Charles Petty at the State Agricultural College. She served as secretary of the Grafton Star Grange. She was taking shorthand classes in Manchester. She had plans and a life that extended well beyond the farm. She also noticed things about Frank Almy that she could not quite account for. He would not speak about his past, not vaguely, not selectively, not at all. There were flashes of temper that passed quickly but left a residue. Something in his manner suggested a man managing himself carefully, the way a person does when they have learned that the unmanaged version causes damage. She was not indifferent to him. She may even have liked him. But she was clear-eyed, and what she saw gave her pause. In the winter of 1891, Christy Warden was in Manchester for her shorthand course. From there, she wrote Frank Almy a letter. She had clearly thought about what she wanted to say, and she said it without softening it past the point of usefulness. She told him she needed to be honest with him and true to herself. She told him the kind of man she wanted to love, one whose life was open, whose conscience was clear. She told him that he had set himself in defiance of God and man, that she believed he had suffered for it, and that she would not choose to share that suffering with him. She had watched him long enough to know that the suffering was real, and that he carried it in the way he held himself back from every direct question, in the way his temper moved through him like weather. She named what she saw. She did not pretend it was something else. Then she said something about marriage. She would never marry a man with the intention of reforming him, she wrote. The reformation would have to come first. She was 28 years old, educated, employed, building a life by deliberate choices, and she had no interest in making someone else's transformation the organizing project of her own. That was not coldness, it was precision. But then she left a door open. She told him she would test the strength of his love. She asked whether he could open himself to good influences, practice self-control, and wait. If he could, she wrote, she believed he might win in the end, because he had qualities she admired, and she could not help liking him in spite of everything. One sentence of possibility, surrounded by pages of clarity. She almost certainly meant it as the minor clause it was, a small acknowledgement of genuine feeling, carefully hedged. Frank Almy kept the letter. He had it with him when he was captured. Whether he read it as a refusal or as a promise is the question the rest of this story answers. He read the door she left open and walked through it, and everything else she had written, the defiance, the suffering, the reformation that had to come first, he set aside. A man who had spent 7 years collecting string in a prison cell knew something about sustained, selective attention. He kept what was useful and ignored the rest. In March 1891, Andrew Warden did not renew his contract. The farm had less work as winter ended. When Almy said goodbye to the family, a witness later reported, he wept. He went to Massachusetts. He rented a room from a landlady whose name the newspapers would later record. He stayed for 2 months. At some point during those 2 months, he showed his landlady a photograph. Christy Warden. He told her it was the woman he loved. He told her something else. The landlady remembered the exact words. If he could not have her, he said, then no other man would either. She did not know who Frank Almy was. She did not know that Frank Almy was not his name. She knew only what he told her, which was almost nothing. She remembered the photograph. She remembered the sentence. In June of 1891, Frank Almy boarded a train back to New Hampshire. The Warden farm had 3 barns, joined together, filled from wall to wall and floor to ceiling with hay. Almy arrived late one night and went inside. He dug. Working in the dark and in silence, he excavated a space inside the hay large enough to lie in, large enough to sit in, large enough to sustain a man through weeks of waiting. He positioned it against a wall. Through that wall, at eye level, there was a knothole. Through the knothole, he could see the farmyard. He had brought things with him: 2 revolvers, gifts intended for Christy, and a copy of Rudyard Kipling's The Light That Failed, a novel about a war photographer who loses his sight and cannot hold the woman he loves. Whether he saw anything of himself in it, he never said. Then he settled in. The interior of a packed hay barn in a New Hampshire summer is not comfortable. The temperature inside the stack could climb well above the air outside. The hay pressed on all sides, dry and dense, releasing dust with every small movement. There were insects. There was the smell of old grain and animal heat, and his own body over days and then weeks without washing. Every noise from the farmyard carried through the walls. The creak of the barn door in the morning, the sound of Andrew Warden moving through his daily work, the voices of the family he had lived alongside for 9 months. Through the knothole, he watched. He watched the yard in the early morning when the farm came to life, and in the long afternoons, and in the evenings when the light changed. He watched for Christy when she came out of the house, which direction she walked, whether she was alone. She was rarely alone. She moved between the farm and Professor Petty's house on the college grounds, between her work and the Grange and the ordinary obligations of a full life. And there was always someone nearby, always another person between her and any moment of privacy. The days accumulated. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month. At night he left, moving in darkness, barefoot to reduce noise. He made his way to neighboring farms and took what he needed: eggs, milk, canned goods, fruit from kitchen gardens. He returned before light, fed himself inside the hay, and waited again. The routine held a kind of terrible discipline. The same man who had once carried chloroform and strychnine on his person as practical tools was now living on stolen eggs and patience, 30 feet from the family of the woman he intended to confront. One night he went further. He broke into the Warden house itself, moving through the rooms quietly, looking for Christy. She was not there. He learned she was staying at Professor Petty's house on the college grounds, and went there instead. Inside he found a different woman, a house guest named Amelia Thompson, asleep or nearly so. He grabbed her by the throat and told her that if she said a word about his visit, he would kill her. She did not report it immediately. He went back to the barn, the knothole, the hay, the heat, the family on the other side of the wall, eating their meals and doing their work, entirely unaware that the man they had dismissed in March was lying in the dark, watching them through a hole in the wood. He had Christie's letter. He had her photograph. He had 2 loaded revolvers and 30 feet of separation, and the absolute certainty, it seems, that at some point the right moment would present itself. It did not present itself. So, on the evening of July 17th, he went out to make one. Christy Warden attended the Grange meeting on the evening of July 17th with her mother and sister and their neighbor Louisa Goodell. It was a routine gathering, the kind she had attended many times as the organization's secretary. It ended at the usual hour, and the 4 women started home along Lime Road. The spot where Almy stepped onto the road was known locally as the Vale of Tempe, a name borrowed from the celebrated valley in Thessaly, the one the ancient poets described as a place of exceptional beauty, shaded and cool, a refuge from the summer heat. What followed was documented in testimony by Louisa and Fanny Warden, and by the 2 physicians who conducted the post-mortem examination. Almy said what he said. He took Christy by the arm. Fanny held on and was dragged through the fence alongside her sister before losing her grip in the dark. Christy's voice came from somewhere in the meadow. Almy fired at Fanny and missed, and she ran. When Fanny returned with Emmett Marshall, they heard 2 more shots and saw Almy vanish into the brush. Christy was on the ground. The first shot had been fired point blank into her head. The second, the physicians testified at trial, had been fired after she was already dead. There was no way, they said, to characterize the first shot as accidental. Fanny Warden's testimony at trial was the most complete account of what happened in that meadow. She had been there. She had held her sister's arm. She had heard her sister's voice. She was 17 years old. The search for Frank Almy became one of the largest manhunts in New Hampshire history. A reward of $5,000 was posted. His physical description was printed and circulated across New England within days. Medium height, dark complexion, now wearing a full beard. Reports placed him in Boston, in Vermont, on the coast of Maine, in Massachusetts mill towns. Each report generated a search. Each search led nowhere. Law enforcement resources poured into a pursuit that covered hundreds of miles of territory, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and produced nothing. He was in the barn. Through the rest of July and into August, Frank Almy lay in the same excavated space where he had spent the previous month, on the other side of the wall from the Warden family. The knothole was still there, the hay still pressed in on all sides. Whatever he was waiting for now was not Christy. The family whose daughter he had killed moved through the farmyard 30 feet away. They milked cows, repaired fences, prepared meals. Somewhere in New England, $5,000 waited for whoever could find Frank Almy. No one could find him, because no one thought to look inside the grief of the people he had left behind. On the 19th of August, Louisa Warden noticed something in the barn, a hollow in the hay, concealed behind a piece of wood. Inside, a jelly jar, empty beer bottles, empty tin cans. The domestic arrangement of a space that had been occupied for some time, and recently. She told the sheriff. That night, 2 men staked out the barn. At around 2 in the morning, a barefoot figure in torn clothing entered through the door. The following day, hundreds of Hanover residents arrived at the farm. The Lebanon Free Press would describe them as the curious, the do-nothings, and the fault-finders. They attacked the hay with pitchforks, working their way methodically from one end of the barn toward the other. Hay flew. Dust rose. The barn filled with noise and motion and the growing pressure of a crowd that had been waiting 6 weeks for something to happen. When they reached him, Almy opened fire from inside the stack. People scattered, stumbling over each other toward the door. The shooting stopped. For 2 hours, negotiators stood at the barn entrance and talked, calling in, waiting, calling in again. Then, a group of men rushed the structure together. They pulled him out of the hay. He was wounded, filthy, barely recognizable as the man described in the newspaper circulars. They dragged him to a wagon. On the road, someone called for a rope. Several people called for a rope. Cooler heads, as the papers put it, prevailed. He was taken to the Wheelock House Hotel in Hanover, because the town had no jail secure enough to hold him. The crowd that gathered around the Wheelock House numbered over 1,000. The fear of a lynching was real enough that officials spent considerable effort managing it. What they settled on was this: the people would be allowed to see him. 1,500 residents of Hanover and the surrounding area filed past the room where Frank Almy lay on a cot, wounded from the capture. They came one after another through most of the day. They looked at him, then they left. It is worth pausing on that number. 1,500 people in a New Hampshire college town in 1891, standing in a line to look at a man through a doorway. Some of them had known Christy Warden. Some had known the family for years. Some had never met any of them and had simply driven or walked in from the surrounding towns because this was the thing that was happening. Meanwhile, someone had gone to the Vale of Tempe with the same purpose. By the time a reporter visited the site some weeks after the murder, every leaf and twig within arm's reach had been removed. People had picked the place clean, carrying home whatever they could find. The brush where Almy had disappeared into the darkness was stripped bare. The trial opened on November 16, 1891. Frank Almy entered a guilty plea and asked a panel of 2 judges to determine the degree, first or second, and therefore whether the sentence would be death. The warden of Windsor Prison appeared and identified the defendant as George Abbott, escaped convict, 8 years outstanding on a 15-year sentence. Almy denied it, completely, consistently, from that day until the end. The judges ruled that testimony regarding George Abbott's history was inadmissible. The case would be tried against Frank Almy, whoever Frank Almy was. The most significant testimony came from Louisa and Fanny Warden. They described Lime Road and the fence and the meadow. They described what they heard and what they saw. The two physicians gave their findings. The shot to the head could not have been accidental, and the second shot had been fired with the knowledge that Christy Warden was already dead. Then Almy spoke in his own defense for several hours. He spoke about love. Christy had agreed to marry him, he said. The Warden family had treated him unjustly, and that injustice was the source of all the trouble. If Mrs. Warden had spoken one pleasant word to him, he said, he would not be standing where he was standing. The judges found him guilty of murder in the first degree. A procedural irregularity, Almy had not been present when the verdict was formally entered, required a second trial, held in April 1892. The outcome was the same. The New Hampshire Supreme Court upheld the verdict in July 1892. Frank Almy had been found guilty. George Abbott had never officially existed in this courtroom. The name on the judgment was the one he had chosen for himself in the years after Windsor, the one that had brought him north, to a farm, to a barn, to a knothole in a wall. Frank Almy was hanged on May 16, 1893, before an invitation-only audience of 150 people. The execution was conducted inside the prison and proceeded without incident. He was buried in the prison's Potter's Field, in a section of Blossom Hill Cemetery in Concord, reserved for those who died in state custody with no family to claim them. The name on the record was Frank Almy. George Abbott, born in Salem, Massachusetts in 1857, whose mother died 3 days after his birth, whose father hanged himself in a barn in North Thetford upon learning of his son's first conviction, was never officially produced in a New Hampshire courtroom, never sentenced. In the legal record of this case, a rumor. What the record shows instead is this: a man named Frank Almy, whose history before 1887 is unaccounted for, was convicted of the murder of Christy Clarissa Warden on the evening of July 17, 1891, at a place called the Vale of Tempe, outside Hanover, New Hampshire. Christy Warden is buried in Dartmouth Cemetery. The distance between the two graves is approximately 12 kilometers.